All right, so please join me in welcoming Mark Newlin. This is Mouse Jack injecting keystrokes into wireless mice.
Well, thank you guys for braving the lines to come out and see me talk. My name is Mark Newlin, and I work as a security researcher at Bastille Networks. And so I spend a lot of time working with software-defined radios and thinking about the security of wireless devices. Before I joined Bastille, I got into software-defined radio by way of a couple DARPA challenges. So in 2011, I competed in the DARPA Shredder Challenge, which was this competition to figure out how to reassemble shredded documents. And I ended up doing pretty well on that, and I finished that in 3rd place out of the 9,000 or so teams. And I decided after that that I would sign up for any future DARPA challenges that seemed feasible to do in my spare time. So in 2013, DARPA announced the Spectrum Challenge, which was their first software-defined radio competition. And I signed up despite not knowing what SDR was. And there was a 3-week period between signing up and the start of the qualifying round. So I managed to learn just enough to qualify as a finalist. And I had the great distinction of being the only solo finalist team, and I was also the only finalist who hadn't gone to college. Then at Bastille, I've been responsible for the mouse jack and key sniffer vulnerabilities, which is why I'm up here today. So I'm going to start with some background on the project, get into the vulnerabilities, do some demos, and then have time for some questions. So the scope of this talk is 16 vulnerabilities I've identified in non-Bluetooth wireless keyboards and mice. These are proprietary protocols with devices from 16 different vendors, 4 different families of transceivers, and they're mostly keystroke injection vulnerabilities, and most of the devices cannot be patched just due to hardware limitations. On the keystroke injection side, we have 3 basic scenarios. We have unencrypted keystrokes, which we're sending to a USB dongle for a mouse or a USB dongle for a keyboard. And then in some cases, we can actually generate our own encrypted keystrokes without knowledge of the AES key and inject those into the USB dongle of a keyboard. Then we have a number of unencrypted keyboards, and for these, we can sniff and clear text all of the keystrokes a user is typing, and also inject keystrokes into those. Then we have a forced pairing vulnerability affecting certain Logitech devices. We have a malicious macro programming vulnerability, and for this, an attacker can program a keystroke macro into somebody's mouse to trigger the next time they hit a certain button. And then we have some denial of service vulnerabilities affecting a few Lenovo devices. And you might think that these kind of vulnerabilities are specific to these second-tier, more obscure vendors, but it turns out that really a lot of primary vendors in this market sell vulnerable devices. So everybody on this list has at least one keystroke injection vulnerability, and many have keystroke sniffing and other vulnerabilities as well. And I'm going to read the list just because it's really fun to say. So we have Logitech, HP, Microsoft, Dell, Anker, Lenovo, Toshiba, Amazon, Gigabyte, Insignia, Schmaus, HDE, GE Jasco, Radio Shack, EagleTech, and Kensington. And so it's really an industry-wide problem. So before I continue, I want to highlight some prior research in this space. In 2010, Thorsten Schroeder and Max Mosier discovered that the XOR encryption used on certain Microsoft wireless keyboards was weak. And what they discovered is that the address of the keyboard was XORed with a payload, and that was the encryption. So they custom fabricated a device to sniff keystrokes from these Microsoft wireless keyboards, but it was kind of a high barrier to entry because it was custom hardware. So in 2011, Travis Goodspeed discovered this kind of pseudo-promiscuous mode that you can use on these common Nordic semiconductor radios. And using that, he was able to demonstrate the same type of keystroke sniffing using commodity hardware. Then last year, Sammy Kamkar built this device called KeySweeper, which is a USB wall adapter. And inside, he had a microcontroller and a Nordic radio and a GSM radio. And he demonstrated sniffing these Microsoft XOR encrypted keystrokes and then sending them back over a GSM backhaul. So on a high level, you might think that a mouse and a keyboard, when you're using it, is communicating directly with your computer. But really, there are 2 steps to the communication process. First, your mouse or keyboard sends a radio packet to your USB dongle. This is in response to you moving the mouse, clicking the mouse, or typing on the keyboard. And the mouse and keyboard has no idea that there's a computer. All it knows is it's sending this data to a radio inside that USB dongle. Then the other side of the link is the USB dongle plugged into the computer. The USB dongle receives these radio packets from the mouse or keyboard, determines what they mean, and generates USB human interface device packets, which it sends over USB to the host computer. And then the host computer does not know that the source of the keystrokes or mouse movement was a wireless device. So the keystroke injection vulnerabilities and force pairing vulnerabilities take advantage of that second side of the link and send radio packets directly to a victim's USB dongle. And from the computer standpoint, because it cannot distinguish between malicious packets and legitimate packets that the user typed, the USB dongle has no way to filter these out. For the keystroke injection, or sniffing side rather, it's looking at the other side of the link. When you're typing on an unencrypted wireless keyboard, it's sending these keystroke packets to your USB dongle. But because they are unencrypted packets, an attacker can simply decode those going over the air and see everything you're typing. So when I started this project, it wasn't a vulnerability research project, and I wasn't yet on the research team at work. I had done a lot of protocol decoder implementations with software-defined radios for known protocols up until this point, but I really wanted to see what the process was like to figure out how an unknown or undocumented protocol works. And for me, the clear choice was the Logitech mouse I was using at the time. And so I started doing some research to see if Logitech had published any data on how their wireless mice communicate. And I came across this quote from a white paper in 2009 where they say, since the displacements of a mouse would not provide any useful information to a hacker, the mouse reports are not encrypted. And this is a reasonable statement because if all you can do is listen to the direction of somebody's mouse movement and the timing of their clicks, that doesn't really leak a lot of data. But because they used the word hacker in there, I decided that I was going to find some vulnerabilities. And so I started thinking about this from more of a security standpoint. So I did the initial research using this Logitech mouse and a software-defined radio. And for this, it was passive receive-only sniffing. So I was using GNU radio and a software-defined radio decoder to decode the packets going over the air between the mouse and dongle. So I could see what the mouse was transmitting and what the dongle was transmitting. And this allowed me, because it was unencrypted, to figure out the payload structure that the mouse was using and start to get an idea of how this protocol behaves. The problem is you couldn't do a transceiver very well with this for timing constraints. So for example, if you want to spoof a dongle, you need to be able to receive a packet from a mouse and then reply to that with an ACK on the order of a millisecond or maybe even microseconds. With the SDR decoder, by the time you know you need to send an ACK, that timeout has elapsed. So I needed more of a specialized setup. And conveniently at the time, this was last July, I was getting ready for Burning Man last year. And for Burning Man, I built this giant LED covered top hat. And the only thing I could think to do with this top hat was make a wireless NES controller for it. And it turns out I put the same type of radio, a Nordic semiconductor chip, in the NES controller as Logitech uses in their wireless keyboards and mice. So I'm building this hat and working on this NES controller. And I got the NES controller built about a week before DEF CON last year. And it occurred to me that I could actually update the firmware on the controller to behave like a Logitech mouse. So I set it up so I could listen for nearby Logitech mice. When it found a mouse, it would start spoofing that, and I could control that person's mouse with the D-pad for moving the cursor around, and then right and left click with the A and B buttons. But the problem was everybody had Logitech mice last year at DEF CON. So I would be controlling a mouse, but I would have no idea whose mouse I was talking to. So I added this mayhem button, and this would generate random movement and click packets. And I would hold that down for a second or two and look around and see who's either screaming at their friends or violently pulling their dongle out. And it made it pretty easy to identify the actual mouse I was talking to. So good for trolling, but still not practical. And then I found my way to the IoT Village last year, and they were using a Logitech mouse for their presentation clicker. And so I wrote this haiku that I think summarizes the experience. IoT Village, a Logitech mouse clicker, did not like the hacks. And as you can see with that post-it note, they politely asked me to stop fucking with them, which I did. So after DEF CON, I decided to make things more complicated. And so I added this OLED display to the front of the controller. And this made it possible to have a visual enumeration of the nearby devices, so I could select a specific device and control it at will. And then the asterisk next to the channel number indicates activity. So I could correlate this visual activity with somebody moving their mouse and see whose mouse it was. And I also wanted to see how much stuff I could fit inside the controller. And this got kind of out of hand, and I ended up with a Teamsy and 5 radios and a LiPo battery and charge controller and the OLED display and 32 gigs of SD storage, which was not necessary, but still fun. And so I went to TorCon last year, and I gave a talk about this NES controller. But the problem was I didn't have any vulnerabilities. It was just a neat toy I built. So I implemented this on-screen keyboard attack that you can do with wireless mouse communication. And the way this works, on Windows 8.1 and 10, assuming a computer is at the default DPI settings, you can actually deterministically open the on-screen keyboard, and then deterministically put it in this tablet mode. And this mode works so you can have a thumb on each corner of the screen if you have a touchscreen. But what's nice is it's anchored to the bottom left and bottom right-hand corner of the screen. So then you can easily get to those corners. You can just go really far left and really far down. And from there, it's a fixed number of pixels up and over to each character. And this made it possible to do an actual keystroke injection attack using the on-screen keyboard without any visibility of the screen. But it was not practical because you had to go very slow. So cursor acceleration kicks in pretty quick. And that means you have to go basically 1 pixel a millisecond, somewhere in that order, in order to know where on the screen you've moved the cursor. So it takes a few seconds to type each key. So maybe several minutes of moving a mouse around and clicking the on-screen keyboard to execute an attack. So a fun demo, but not terribly functional in the wild. So I was getting back from TorCon, and the project had more or less run its course. I had built a neat toy, hadn't found any vulnerabilities, gave a talk, learned some stuff about the Logitech protocol. But I really wanted to continue this because I had this gut feeling that there was something to find. So I kept working on this in my spare time. And at this point, I had a pretty good idea of how this protocol worked. The mice aren't encrypted. The keyboards are encrypted. And so I could see what the mouse was sending over the air and what the USB dongle was sending to the host computer for mouse movement. And then I could see the encrypted data the keyboard was sending and the unencrypted data the USB dongle was sending to the host computer. And I was able to infer what an unencrypted keyboard packet might look like over the air. So I tried sending this, and lo and behold, it was accepted. And this was the first vulnerability I had ever found. So I got pretty excited, and I started collecting wireless mice and keyboards. And I basically went on Amazon and just ordered everything I could find. But the problem was, now I had these 50 devices, and I had to be very, very efficient about evaluating them, because if I took a week per device, that would be kind of insane. So my general strategy was to pwn all the peripherals. And it turns out that it worked out pretty well. So for each device, I would start with some open source intelligence. So this would be going to the FCC website and looking up frequency information, modulation schemes, bandwidths where available. If there were documented transceivers, I would look up the spec sheets for those. And I would use this data to implement a software-defined radio decoder. And this would allow me to see the physical layer packets going over the air between the device and its USB dongle. It wouldn't necessarily tell me what that data meant if it was encrypted, for example, but I could at least decode the packets going over the air. And this white box in the bottom right-hand corner there, this is from a Radio Shack device. And I love this. Please use the transceiver in human house only, and then children don't to install the transceiver. And it's unclear what exactly they're trying to communicate there, but there's a lot of these kind of English that involved in these FCC docs, so it's somewhat entertaining. So after I would have the SDR decoder, I would then try to figure out how the protocol worked. The first step of this was figuring out what the payload formats were. So in the case of an unencrypted device like a mouse, it's just a matter of clicking different buttons and seeing what bits and bytes change over the air. In the case of the keyboards, if they're encrypted, you might say there's an incrementing counter here or a sequence number here or that sort of thing. And after I had a basic idea of how the protocol worked, I would start to look for low-hanging fruit. And in some cases, this would be an unencrypted keyboard, and then it's immediately vulnerable to sniffing and injection. There's actually a mouse which sends unencrypted keyboard packets from a mouse, and that was another easy sell. There's a lot of tech devices that send this raw USB HID data. In that case, it was just sending keyboard HID data in that place. In a lot of cases, there were some pretty quick vulnerabilities to find. But if there weren't, I would get into the fuzzing. And the basic premise here was to send unexpected data to a USB dongle and see if I could get it to produce a keystroke on the other end. And so I used the USBmon kernel module in Wireshark to monitor the data going between the USB dongle and the computer. And then I would initially use the NES controller to send packets to that USB dongle. If I got it to produce something that looked like a keystroke, I would then look at the last 30 seconds or so of radio packets and work out exactly what I had to send to get it to generate that keystroke. One problem here is that even if you disable the keyboard using X input, the magic sysrequest keys still work. And so if you spam a bunch of random keystroke packets to your computer, it really, really quickly causes a hard reset. So I found disabling magic sysrequest during this process to be pretty vital. So most of these devices are based on the Nordic Semiconductor NRF24L